here we go, the last section of invertebrates. This will be invertebrate lecture number 4, I think, 404. So next we have the phylum Annelida. Annelids are a type of worm, and there's several groups in here we're going to talk about. They have repeated body segments. They have certain sections that are often specialized, and these sections are often connected to one another. And I'll start with the classification a little bit. We'll talk about the earthworms just quickly, and then move on to the polychaeta worms, which is where really the marine worms are at. The Oligochaeta are earthworms, and I mention them here because everybody usually knows what an earthworm is. They don't have parapodia on them, and I'm going to show you what that is in a second. And each little segment, as you can see here, there's segments on them, are little tiny hairs, and that helps the earthworm, in this case, hold on to the dirt as it moves through the dirt. Now, really the big group of marine worms are the Polychaeta or the polychaeta worms, and these have a very well-developed head. They have parapodia, which are these little paddles, like little feet almost, that stick out of the side of the animal, and quite often those parapodia have setae that help it grip the surface of what it's crawling through. Many of them are tube dwelling, and some of them are free living. You can see some examples here. This one in the middle is called the giant innkeeper worm, and it lives inside a tunnel. And I put a YouTube video link up so you can check that one out from the Marine Aquarium if you want. And then we'll move on to the phylum Tardigrada. The tardigrades are considered one of the toughest animals in the world. The common name of these is water bears. They can survive in ridiculous temperatures. Their name means slow stepper. They're a good example of cryptobiosis, which is basically an animal that can survive in tough conditions. Like we send them to space to see how they tolerate really bad, non-Earth-like conditions, and they can survive many years without food or water. And interestingly, I just found an article someone wrote that it turns out sometimes heat seems to kill them, so maybe they're not as indestructible as we've always thought. Okay, the next phylum is the biggest group of animals that have been identified in the world, and that is the phylum Arthropoda. And all of these so far, just as a reminder, the tardigrades, the earthworms, the annelid worms, and the arthropods, these all fall under the same developmental stage as being protostomes, which means that first opening, that blastopore, is what is going to become the mouth. So the phylum Arthropoda has a hard exoskeleton, and it's a segmented body. Often they have paired appendages, like you can see in this lobster here. They tend to have an open circulatory system. We mentioned that last time. And this contains 80% of all the identified species so far, which is over 1 million. And there are probably more bacteria and nematodes in the world, but in terms of so far what we've identified, this is the largest group. All right, a little bit about arthropod diversity and taxonomy as we move into this group. First of all, I want to mention once again this versatile exoskeleton. All arthropods have the skeletal system, this hard outside shell that's on the outside of the body rather than on the inside of the body. And the one theory is that exoskeleton has been very important in the evolution of arthropods. In terms of classification, there's a huge number of groups, and I'll move through and I'll point out the ones that I need you to know for marine biology. So we'll skip some of these, but what I want you to notice first of all is that we have our typical kingdom, phylum, and class. So we have phylum Arthropoda, but one of the things that happens with certain taxonomic groups, such as the arthropods, is there are so many groups that they start making sort of smaller divisions. So you'll see here Subphylum Trilobata, and when you see something like a subphylum, that's a term meant to represent something it's smaller than a phylum, but it's bigger than a class, and that allows for more groupings basically. And so you'll notice that we have a total here of 5 different subphylums in the phylum Arthropoda, and we'll go through the ones that are important as they relate to marine biology. So first is the subphylum Trilobata. The trilobites, as they're also known, are all extinct. We know them from the fossil record. They went extinct about 250 million years ago. They have a segmented body without specialization and paired appendages. Then we also have what looks quite similar to the trilobites, but these are still living, is in the subphylum Chelicerata, which also is related to spiders and things like that, is the class Merostomata, and these are the horseshoe crabs, and they have 6 pairs of appendages. 1 pair of them are chelicera, which is something similar to what you find in spiders, and then there are 5 pairs of walking legs, and they've been around a very long time and unchanged since the Triassic period, which goes back maybe 65, 70 million years ago. So in the fossil record, we see these animals have been around for basically unchanged for a long period of time. They're found in shallow coastal waters, as an example, off the east coast, and they have a larva that's similar to trilobites, so we think that there's some connection to those. The next is in that same subphylum is the class Pyconogonida. These are often called sea spiders, but they aren't really true spiders. They look superficially like a spider, and they have these extra duplicated leg segments, and most of them are found in polar oceans. Next we have the subphylum Crustacea. This is a really big group with lots of different examples that you'll be familiar with. There are these are animals that contain 2 pair of antennae, and they have biramous appendages, which means each branch or each leg, for example, has not just 1 branch but 2 branches off each of those legs. And many of them also have chewing mandibles for chewing up food, and their body is usually sort of regionally broke up into segments of 2 or 3. And this is a really big group that includes animals like copepods, which are an important zooplankton, crabs and barnacles and lobsters. Those are all examples of subphylum Crustacea that you're probably familiar with. Then we move on to the phylum Echinodermata. These are the echinoderms, or also called the spiny-skinned animals. And this is the first group we've seen so far that is now a deuterostome, which means during development, that first opening, that blastopore, is now going to become the anus, and the second opening, as it pushes all the way through, is going to become the mouth. So only the echinoderms and the chordates, which include us, are in fact deuterostomes. They have indeterminate cleavage. What that means is when a cell divides, cell division is called cleavage. When cells divide and there become more cells, some cells are indeterminate, which is basically like a stem cell, and stem cells allow for the ability for that cell to become other types of things. And the reason that's important, and the reason you hear about stem cells, is if a person is sick or has some kind of damaged cells, stem cells can maybe be replaced in that spot to take over the cells that you were missing. Okay, so in the phylum Echinodermata, they typically have radial symmetry, and they have a water vascular system, which I'll show you here in a second, and it looks kind of like this. And the only 2 parts of the water vascular system I'm going to make sure that you need to know for sure are the madreporite, which is the opening, and then the tube feet. So the idea is this water vascular system is water goes into the madreporite, and by changing the fluid inside the tube, they can change the suction level of the tube feet, and that's what allows sea stars to hold onto rocks and things like that. There are several classes we'll go through. The first is class Asteroidea. These have 5 arms radiating out from a central disc, and they have a madreporite that is on the aboral side. The aboral side is opposite of the oral side. So in a sea star, the oral side is on the bottom. That's where the mouth is. So aboral means it's on the top. They also contain pedicellaria, or like little miniature pinchers that you can see under a microscope, and that helps keep the sea star clean. And they have papillae, which are these little tiny nipple-looking structures, and those are used for respiration. Next, we have the Ophiuroidea. The Ophiuroidea are called brittle stars, and they kind of look like sea stars, but there's some important differences. One, they have the madreporite that's on the oral side, so it's opposite as it is on a sea star. They have 5 thin arms radiating out from a central disc, but they don't have any suckers on the tube feet, so they actually can't grip things like a sea star. They also don't have the pedicellariae or the papillae. The next group is the Echinoidea, and these are sea urchins. And there's a purple sea urchin you can see here as an example, which is a common species we have off our coast. And they don't really have arms, but they have 5 rows of where the tube feet would be. And if you look at the test here, which is the shell of a dead one, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows of where those tube feet would be. So if you look, you can see 5 rows of tube feet there. And if you took a sea star and folded it up, you'd basically have a similar body shape as you would in one of these sea urchins. They contain spines on the outside. They have what's called a closed ambulacral groove. That's just this space that's in between where the tube feet are. They have a madreporite that's on the aboral side, which is like what you see in sea stars, and they contain pedicellariae and papillae. So although they look quite different, they are closely related, it turns out, to sea stars. And they also have this interesting structure called Aristotle's lantern. That's this structure right here in the middle that you can see. And that's a sort of a jaw chewing structure that allows them to chew on kelp and things like that. Next is the class Crinoidea. The Crinoidea are often called sea lilies, and they're attached to substrates like on the bottom of a rock or that kind of thing. And they have these many branched arms. They have no madreporite and no pedicellariae or papillae. And then the last group is the Holothuroidea. These are soft-bodied sea cucumbers, they're also called. They don't really have the ambulacral grooves like you see in some of the other echinoderms, but instead they have these what they're called ambulacral areas or plates where the tube feet would be, but they have an internal madreporite and they have no pedicellariae or papillae, and the plates on those are closed ambulacral plates is what we call those. All right, our final group for today of the invertebrates is the phylum Chordata, which actually is the phylum we're in. The phylum Chordata contains animals that are both invertebrates and vertebrates. And they are deuterostomes just like the echinoderms, which means they have indeterminate cleavage. Indeterminate cleavage, once again, which means that they form the potential stem cells. The blastopore becomes the anus, and they typically have bilateral symmetry, which means you can cut the animal only in one spot where the right and left are the same. And again, both invertebrate and vertebrate types, but they all have 4 anatomical features, and that is the notochord, which is a long flexible rod that usually goes along the back of the animal, and then right below that is where the nervous system is going to be sort of housed, and that space is called the dorsal hollow nerve cord. And then they have pharyngeal gill slits, which are pouches kind of on the side of the head that are used for respiration and sometimes capturing food. And then they have a muscular postanal tail, which is exactly what it sounds like. There's a tail in the animal that goes past where the anus is, and it has muscles associated with it, muscular postanal tail. In the subphylum Urochordata is one interesting animal called a tunicate, and these are sessile animals that only contain the pharynx and the slits as an adult, but as a larval stage, as you can see here, they have all 4 chordate characteristics, and this is a big animal for anyone that studies development in chordates. When I went to UC Santa Cruz, famous marine biologist named Todd Newberry up there is like a world expert on tunicates. Okay, and that's it. The next group we move into will be the vertebrates, which will include fish in our next lecture. Hope everyone's having a good day. Talk to you soon.